Good evening, everyone, on this October evening. I'm Laura Goldman. I'm the registered dietitian working with Premier Weight Loss and happy to share this evening's webinar with you. The topic is a bit of a hybrid of a few items we've discussed before in the past. So some of this might be a rehash for you if you've listened to some of the items I've discussed before, but hopefully there'll be a few new nuggets of information. So the topic is mood and food, the gut-brain connection. And it actually makes me think of when I was much younger and before I even knew what a dietitian was, I used to think about how interesting it was that it seemed that food and how you're feeling seemed to interweave a lot. And this topic, we're going to just touch some very broad strokes because you can get into the weeds very easily with many of these things. And hopefully this will shed some light on the everyday foods you're eating, as well as know that not only are you benefiting yourself maybe physically or protein-wise, muscularly, but also mentally as well. So as I like to say every week, remember it's the quality of your calories that matters because when we're eating fewer calories with the usual side effect that we can expect from those GLP-1 medications, then it's really important to choose high quality foods so you can maximize the benefit that you'd be getting from those. So what we're covering today, as we mentioned before, is that gut-brain connection that you can expect. Also, how GLP-1 medications may be involved in this type of communication. And I'll cover some foods that seem to help support your mood and overall mental well-being. And finally, at the very end, we'll talk about practical strategies so that you can use this in your day-to-day. As always, I leave time for questions at the end, so feel free to hit that question button at the very bottom of your screen, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this topic or other nutrition-related topics that may come to mind. First and foremost, let's talk about that gut-brain connection. And this is an area that I believe is constantly being studied because we're learning something new practically every day. But we know that our gut and our brain have a lot more communication going on than you might think. And it's almost like they're just on the telephone with each other, constantly talking like two best friends. One way that they do communicate is through the vagus nerve, which is essentially the superhighway of communication. But we also know that the immune system has signaling. So T cells are involved in our immune system. And of course, hormones and neurotransmitters also are produced in our gut and communicate with our brain. And perhaps you've joined me for one of my previous presentations where we talk about gut bacteria because they are certainly involved, along with creating vitamins, B vitamins, K2. They also form some beneficial compounds, such as short chain fatty acids, but they are part of the immune system and help regulate that. They also produce neurotransmitters. And because of this, along with a few other ways that they're involved, they are associated with mood regulation as well as with weight management. To further dive into the gut and mood, not just the general communication, one little fast fact is about 90% of serotonin, which is that feel-good chemical in your body, one of the feel-good chemicals, 90% of it is made in your gut. So when you are eating something, as the food moves through your GI tract, there are cells in your gut that are stimulated to release that serotonin. There are also some microbiota that can help regulate the production of it. And tryptophan is one of the building blocks. So I know a lot of times, especially as we approach Thanksgiving, people talk about turkey being a source of tryptophan and people talk about being sleepy, but no one talks about how it's a building block for serotonin. Of note, and I think it's important to mention, serotonin that's made in your gut does not directly go to your brain, but there's some thoughts that it may communicate still through the vagus nerve. And as I was talking about bacteria on the slide before, you can know that it also helps produce GABA, which is sort of that calmness that you might hear about. I know sometimes there are GABA supplements, but know that your bacteria can also help produce that. Dopamine, which many people talk about being that reward chemical. And I talked about those short chain fatty acids, which can help with inflammation in the body, but also help maintain brain health. Moving on to the GLP-1 medications. You may ask, well, what does all of this have to do with the gut and the mood? As you know, GLP-1 medications do have an influence on appetite and satiety, which is part of that communication, just like the GLP-1 our body naturally produces, which communicates with the brain. This one behaves in a very similar way. So it also is going to communicate with the brain and say, I'm feeling full or I'm not so hungry. And it does seem to have an influence on that reward or dopamine effect, which is why some people will report that if they take GLP-1 medications, maybe they're not craving foods the way they used to. It's not just about appetite suppression, but it's also just this feeling of, actually, that doesn't interest me right now, whereas perhaps beforehand it would have. Something interesting I read while putting all this together is there's also some thoughts that GLP-1 medications may be neuroprotective, so protecting the cells in your brain, which is always an advantage there, trying to keep them as sharp as possible. And you or someone you know may have noticed or mentioned that you're actually feeling happier and more positive. Some of that may be due to you experiencing the effects that you're looking for toward your weight loss goals. But I think there are other people who tend to just feel like they have a more positive outlook overall, regardless of the amount of weight loss that they're achieving. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that alternatively, although this, in my experience, is far fewer people, but alternatively, there are some people who do report a decrease in their mood and how they're feeling. And I would strongly encourage you to always speak with your provider about that if you're noticing those feelings, because certainly that's not an outcome that we're looking for. If that's independent, of course, in calories, which maybe that's not. And so if you're not eating enough calories, certainly you can also have a decreased mood from that alone. So it's always good to talk it over with your providers to see what's going on there. So when we're talking about the food and mood connection, so what foods specifically are influencing our mood, not just moving through our gut and not just that connection, but what foods are actually going to be helping us. As I said before, when I started, when eating less, the quality counts. So let's focus on some of these quality items. When we're talking about nutrition for your brain in general, protein is always a good one. It seems to pop up everywhere you look. Protein is just ever present when we're talking about nutrition these days, but for a good reason. Also, omega-3 fatty acids are very helpful when it comes to brain health. B vitamins are also helpful. In fact, some people who have a decrease or insufficient amount of B vitamins do have feelings of a worse mood overall. So that's also quite interesting to see if it's a vitamin deficiency. Choline, which can be found in egg yolks, as well as other minerals and other vitamins. So they all can be involved in your overall brain health. In terms of your microbiome, so part in your gut, those bacteria that can help with the communication between your gut and brain. Fiber is super helpful because that's going to help it thrive, and also avoiding less added sugar, avoiding those processed foods that will also help stimulate the gut bacteria to grow and thrive in a healthy manner. since we were talking briefly about those types of foods, I figured it was best for me to outline in a little more detail in each area. So when we're talking about probiotic foods, that's going to help add and maintain the good bacteria in your gut. And that involves a lot of fermented foods, yogurt and kefir. So the ones that say live active cultures, of course, as well as tempeh or kimchi, sauerkraut, or kombucha. There's also prebiotics or fiber, and those help to feed the bacteria that are in your gut. You can find prebiotics in a variety of foods. Some that are notable are garlic and onions, inulin, which you may see added in certain protein bars to help add fiber. Chicory root is the same there, adding some fiber, and I see that ingredient a lot in protein bars. Asparagus, green bananas tend to be higher in prebiotics than fully ripe yellow bananas, as well as non-starchy vegetables, legumes, so beans, and whole fruits. As far as omega-3s are involved, as you all know, fatty fish, but also walnuts, chia seeds, and flax seeds. Important to note, you can buy flaxseed whole, but I strongly encourage you to grind it up before you use it because that will help unlock those omega-3s. Otherwise, it will pass through you and not be as helpful. And if you do keep flax seeds in your home, I also encourage you to keep them in the freezer or the refrigerator to help preserve their shelf life. Protein-rich foods, I didn't really list out all of them, as I'm sure by now you've heard the list of high protein foods, including animal sources and plant sources. But know that the protein-rich foods are a good source of B vitamins and the general building blocks for generally every part of our body practically. Finally, complex carbohydrates, which I wanted to mention because oftentimes we talk about low carb, no carb, or you probably hear that a lot. And while I think it's common for us to overdo carbohydrates, they still do have a purpose. And one of them, when they're complex carbohydrates, so they're slower to digest and be absorbed, they help provide steady energy throughout the day. So you don't have these peaks and valleys of blood sugar and energy. And that can in turn help maintain your overall mood. Some sources of complex carbohydrates involve oats, quinoa, sweet potatoes, whole grains, etc. I still do recommend that if and when you do consume complex carbohydrates, that it is generally in the context of a meal or snack that contains protein as well. So to start, this is part one of, I believe, 2 slides for strategies to use food for your mood. First and foremost, use that balanced plate approach to try and get that right ratio of the foods we're looking for. You can see here on the right, you want about a quarter of your plate to be protein, a quarter of your plate to be those high fiber or complex carbohydrates, and then 50%, if at all possible, non-starchy vegetables. And I know we're not always eating off of a plate, maybe it's in a bowl or something like that, but try and imagine 50% of whatever it is you're eating to be non-starchy vegetables. Typically, this is usually lunch and dinner. Not many people eat vegetables in the morning, but if you do, I commend you. Also, and this doesn't really fit in with the plate, I couldn't draw it in there exactly, but remember that you should use healthy fats whenever there's a fat involved. So olive oil, maybe for cooking, nuts to eat on the side, avocado if you have a salad, and consider some fermented foods. Maybe you enjoy sauerkraut or kimchi if you're having an Asian dish, or if you're like me and eat yogurt for breakfast every morning, consider adding that into your daily routine. Also, try and stay consistent or whatever is consistent for you. It is easy to skip meals, but be aware that that can worsen your mood and your overall energy. And again, if your serving sizes are much smaller because your appetite is smaller, we don't really want to encourage skipping entire meals because it's still important to get in calories for general functioning and also to get those high quality calories throughout the day. Very important to mention as well, don't skip out on hydration. Many of us tend to forget about drinking water throughout the day, but that comes in very handy throughout the day and can help maintain our energy levels as well. And Maybe you don't have the time for a full meal. Try and keep easy snacks available, whether it be, say, a cottage cheese. That's like a Breakstone's cottage cheese. They come in very nice containers that are easy and portable, or maybe some peanut butter and a piece of fruit. Having some snacks nearby are going to be very helpful. Also, just in case, this would also be a time to have maybe a meal replacement drink or a snack type of protein drink. Those can be used in situations where you may not have access to a snack or meal. Some other strategies that are worth implementing are mindful eating. So slow down when you're eating and try and reduce distractions throughout your dining experience. So remember, have that at the forefront and not necessarily an afterthought. If you're in a meeting and everyone's eating a whole bunch but not really thinking about what they're eating, it can be easy to overdo it. Or maybe it's a stressful environment and you may end up overeating out of stress. Mindful eating also involves responding to eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full. And that one's a little bit difficult to do with these medications, but it's still very helpful. And sometimes it's always nice to, when you're sitting down to eat, thinking, how is this food helping me reach my goals? Am I choosing something that's benefiting me and going to bring me where I want to go? Sometimes having that stop and pause can also be very beneficial for a variety of reasons. And I know that we are talking about food and mood, but in order to keep our gut healthy and just general mood benefits in general, outside of the food categories, remember to stay active. Even 10 extra minutes walking when you wouldn't have normally can be very helpful for your overall mood and well-being. Getting enough sleep, working on stress management. Take time to be social. Don't avoid those social engagements, because I know sometimes it's very tempting to do so, especially if you feel like there's going to be a lot of quote unquote bad food out there. You do want to have that socialization if possible. And staying active, maybe you want to introduce having some time in nature, going to a park while we still have the weather for it can be very helpful as well, just to be out and about. Nature exposure seems to be very beneficial for our overall well-being as well, getting that fresh air. With all those strategies being said, I think it's also good to try and set a goal. So think about your goal for the week, maybe have a little bit of homework to do. And among some of the things I mentioned, try and choose one of the following items here that you aren't already doing. Maybe you want to add a probiotic food to your daily routine, or add one prebiotic food to each meal. Do you have room to add extra garlic? One of my personal mantras is there can never be too much garlic in my food. So feel free to add some, or try and eat more whole fruits, or have a side of beans somewhere where you might not normally. You could also incorporate eating more fatty fish, or if you're like me and don't like seafood or fish, try and add in some chia seeds, some flax seeds, walnuts twice this week. Something that could be exciting is to try a new vegetable that you've never had before, or maybe find a new recipe to prepare a favorite in a different way that you haven't before. We can also work on practicing mindful eating. And if mindful eating sounds interesting to you, I will be touching on that very specifically next week. So you could also save that for next week. And finally, another option is maybe take a 10-minute walk after lunch or dinner to increase that physical activity and just adding a little more to your daily routine that you didn't have before. So think about that. Maybe you want to try one of those goals for the week, or maybe you have one in mind that you can think of that I didn't list here, and that's perfectly fine too. So to summarize this plethora of information, remember that your gut and brain are always communicating with each other. And what you choose to eat can have an influence on how you feel. And it's not always just how you perceive that food as well. As you know, GLP-1 medications are involved in your gut-brain communication. And in order to continue feeding your gut and brain, you want to aim for those nutrient-dense foods. And just remember that all of these things that we're talking about here are the building blocks of creating those lifelong healthy habits, because this is about lifestyle change. It's not just a quick fix. And so implementing these for the long term can help give you benefits for your mood, for your overall health and well-being for years to come. And with that, I leave that open for you if you want to reach out and ask me any questions about this topic or any other topic that we've discussed before, or some other nutrition item that has piqued your interest. Feel free to hit that question button down on the left-hand screen, and you can choose to be anonymous or you can leave your name. And I will just wait here for a minute or two and see if you have any questions this evening. All right. Well, I hope you found this to be informative and helpful. And if you have any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask this evening or think of later, by all means, reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff and they can get you in touch with myself, or they may be able to help answer your question as well. I hope you have a lovely rest of the evening, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.